Welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker is Fiete from UT Austin, and her talk is How Fast is Neural Winner-Take-All When Deciding Between Many Options?
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. It's great to be here. Thanks so much, Bruno, for all your work. I think I'm a nominal co-organizer of this program, but this is like the most pleasant co-organizing experience I've had because he has shouldered the whole burden so I can show up and enjoy this as a participant. So it's really great. And so in the spirit of keeping with the Simon's workshop theme and to bring together some perspectives from computer science and engineering and neuroscience, I thought I'd talk about something a bit different than I have been really talking about recently. So my major interests live in questions of short-term memory and very recently navigation. But we've been working on some questions that come up actually in many different contexts, including spatial navigation. And the question is about estimating the best option and the time complexity or the speed with which it's possible to estimate a good option from many. Okay, so it's a bit ironic that I'm giving you a talk on decision making. I was just telling some friends outside that I'm the worst decision maker, so I guess we study our pathologies. And, and so my motto in life is I'll sit on the fence when I get to it. And so maybe that's why this is a topic that holds some fascination for me. So okay, so this is certainly a decision making problem I think many of us have faced. I face it regularly, and my kids even more so. I love ice cream. So, okay, so what is decision making? In this context, I'm going to define it very narrowly. It's just going to be a question of, you're presented with many options, and assuming that the different options have different, values, then how do you go about evaluating each of them and picking the max, and how long is that going to take? So this is the question. Okay, so first of all, when the decision, when would you want to compute the max or the argmax of a set of options? Well, you would do that, at any time you want to do inference. For example, in large neural circuits, you might want to compute the maximum likelihood. Each neuron is signaling something. Which one is the one signaling with maximum likelihood? Which is the maximum likelihood signal? Maximum posteriori action selection, etc. One can study questions about how humans, in psychophysical experiments, do decision making. Even in a non-neural context. There's social decision making that happens in colonies, for example, to choose the site for the next nest for the colony, or to make a decision as foraging ants go out looking for food sources. They come back and report on the quality of the food source to the nest, and the nest has to decide how to allocate its resources and which food source to go out and harvest and exploit. Right? So this decision, there's always multiple options that are available, and a decision has to be made. And one of the problems with having multiple choices in decision making is that it could take a while, right? I mean, how long? And the question is, how long does it take? Like, how does this problem of choosing the maximum between many options take, and how does it scale as a function of the number of options? Okay, and so why is this question important? Again, I would say that because it really, this max operation is just such a basic part of so many computations. It occurs again and again in the context of many computations. You want to know the time complexity. Okay, and specifically in the neural context, the number of alternatives can be very, very large if you're talking about inference across the states of a large number of neurons in one circuit, right? That could be in the thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands, right? So it's possibly that one has to do this kind of decision making across many alternatives. Okay, and there's some biological examples. There's some suggestions that maybe there's winner-take-all dynamics in Kenyan cells and Drosophila, or maybe even in place cells, to choose like sparse representations when all these neurons are competing to respond and represent some input stimulus. Okay, so and I would also argue that one of the things that we think is a strength of neural computation is its distributed nature, right? So if you take a computation that would serially take a long time, and then you make it efficient by farming it out in a parallel way to many agents or players and neurons, but then if you want to then collect the final result in the end, or pick of all of these different things being evaluated, you have to collect the final answer. If that takes order n time, you distribute it to n agents in parallel, and if it takes order n time to collect the answer and get the max, you've kind of like lost the game, right, of parallel computation. So in a sense, understanding the speed of parallel computation or for max is sort of almost like an essential element to being able to answer whether or not parallel computation makes sense in the brain, right? So I think it's a very basic question. Okay, so to answer this question, I'm going to do it two ways. So first, I'm going to consider this deterministic case, and then which is totally unreal. Nothing in the world or the brain is noiseless, and so, but it sets a stage, and then we'll go to the realistic case, which is the stochastic setting. Okay, so in the deterministic case, so first let's talk about just the intrinsic complexity of the max operation. Forget about neurons for a moment. Okay, so you've got a list of n items. Okay, they're all static, and each one is just some scalar. It's just a number. Okay, and you want to go through this list of items and find the maximum element. Okay, so in a serial, in like a von Neumann strategy, like a serial computer would just go down the list, right, one by one. So it would look at one item in the list and hold that in memory, go to the second item in the list, and then if the second item is bigger than the first item, it would discard the first item in memory, put the next item in, and just go on down the list, right? And once it's done, then it knows the max. So the space complexity, sort of like how much memory it needs, is like 1, but the time complexity is n, because you have to work down. It has to work down serially through the n items. Okay, and now we want to ask then, this is just a reference point, right? And so this is like, the best you can do with the serial strategy. Neural network, we distribute it, so presumably we're going to send one of those inputs in the list, one of the items into the list, to one of each neurons, to one neuron each. And then, so I'll say that the space complexity of this is like n. And the question is, what is the time complexity, right? So can you trade off? Can you take this time of n, put it into space? And if that's true, maybe you would expect that the time should be order 1. It should be independent of n. Okay? So in fact, that's what we would hope for. We'd say if you have a fully efficient harnessing of parallelism, we would hope that the parallel strategy is like the serial strategy divided by n, and so it should be like order 1. That's what, independent of n. Okay? But on the other hand, neural components are certain, they decay over time. They don't maintain, memories. They may also have some noise in them. The question is, does that mean that neural computation can't achieve this fully parallel result? Okay, so what is the neural network setting for computing max and argmax? Well, so the canonical circuit is called the winner-take-all circuit. I think most of you know the setup, so you can think about it this way. You have a bunch of neurons, these colored things, over here, and each of them receives an input, B1, B2, et cetera, and let's just assume that they're ordered, so B1 is bigger than the rest, and the rest, B2 is smaller than B1, and the rest can be the same or small, some drawn from some distribution. And in this setup, each neuron excites itself. So these are the activations of the neurons, X's. Each neuron excites itself at some strength alpha, receives this input B sub I, and in addition, all the neurons then globally inhibit each other. Okay, so you can think about this as like pairwise inhibition, or you can think about all of them projecting to a single inhibitory neuron, which then globally inhibits all of them. Okay, so these are just two equivalent pictures for the same math. And so, so if for appropriate choices of alpha and beta, specifically if they're strong enough each, then it's possible under these conditions to get a global winner-take-all solution where there's a single winner from this computation. And so you see something like all of these activities here decay down to 0. One of them goes up. And so I'm calling R the firing rate and this internal variable here, X. Yeah?
Is this dependent on the statistics of the B sub I?
Yeah, actually. So it turns out that it's almost independent of the statistics of B sub I. Analytically, in this deterministic case, I haven't told you the solution yet, but analytically, it turns out that the only really important thing is the delta, which is the gap between the first two. There's a very weak dependence in the distribution of the rest of them. So for this talk, because it's a short talk, I'm just going to mostly show you results where the rest are equal. So all the other BIs are equal, and then there's a gap delta. But we can talk about the gap dependence offline. Great. Okay. So now, so there's these conditions on that allow winner-take-all dynamics, and these conditions I showed you were this. So alpha should be smaller than 1 for a unique solution to emerge, and alpha plus beta should be bigger than 1 in order for there to be sufficient competition, so that there is at least one winner. And so these are the two conditions. But you can see that these two conditions mean that like you sort of are free in your choice of beta. Okay, and so there are two obvious choices of beta. One choice of beta is to make beta be of order 1 over n, right? Because each neuron is contributing inhibition to the network. If there are n neurons, then this way you're just keeping the total amount of inhibition fixed. So you might want to make it 1 over n. So we'll call that weak inhibition. Okay, so the total inhibition is of strength 1. Or you could have a strong inhibition where each neuron is contributing inhibition of strength 1. This is like really strong, right? And then right, it's just order 1. It doesn't scale with n. And then the total inhibition in the circuit is order n. Okay, and it's not at all obvious, I would say, what regime neural circuits are in. I guess I don't know. We can talk about it. That would be nice to know sort of what we think is going on. Okay, so this is a free choice, okay, of inhibition strength, and the question is, how do things behave? So now in this deterministic winner-take-all setting, I'll just skip to the bottom line. So basically, this is the serial strategy over here. So this is the time complexity of the serial strategy as a function of network size, and as expected, it just grows linearly, right? I mean, that's what I've plotted. It just grows linearly. And a network with weak inhibition also has a linear growth in the decision time with n, okay, which is not what we want. It's as bad as the serial strategy. Okay, on the other hand, if you go to strong inhibition, then we see that a benchmark strategy is flat. It's order 1 in time. It doesn't scale with n. And in fact, the neural network also achieves that, right? So the strong inhibition circuit achieves the parallelism benchmark, okay, but weak inhibition is as slow as serial computation. Okay, so all right, but this is unrealistic. So what we really want to do is study the more interesting case, which is stochastic winner-take-all. So in stochastic winner-take-all, each of the inputs to the neurons, or each of the inputs items in the list, is some mean value plus a fluctuating quantity that just fluctuates about some mean with some variance, okay, over time. And the means are, again, ordered the same way. Okay, so B1 is the biggest, with the B2 has a gap, and the rest are whatever. And now we can consider, again, the serial von Neumann strategy and ask, what is the optimal serial strategy if you want to achieve? So by the way, now once you introduce noise, you can never get correct winner-take-all all the time. You can't be guaranteed a perfect winner-take-all because here the definition of correct winner-take-all is that you actually identify the unit that has, or the input that has actually the largest B1 bar. But you would have to average forever to be sure that you can always get it exactly right. So in stochastic winner-take-all or in stochastic max, one would just has to choose an accuracy, and you have to ask for the time complexity of that accuracy. Yeah.
So the noise is identically distributed?
That's right. All the neurons are receiving IID noise. That's right. That's fluctuating over time. Okay, and so the serial strategy will be that as you go down the list, same way, you just go down the list and look at the element, the first element in the list. But now, because each entry is noisy, you want to dwell for some time and average, get a better estimate of BI bar when you're sitting at the ith element. And the question is, how long should you dwell at that number to assure that you'll get a fixed accuracy even as n is scaled? Okay, and so using concentration inequalities, we find that the amount of time you should dwell is log n, and so therefore the serial strategy will take time n times log n dwell time per entry to assure a constant accuracy. Okay, so now our parallelism benchmark would be that something that takes order n times less than the serial strategy. Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Oh, the log n is because you have n different traits.
It's log n comes from this, yeah, it's like basically you have this distribution, you want to ask that, there's a probability of getting it wrong, which is somewhere in the tail of the distribution, so you use the concentration inequalities to do that. And that's how you get the log n. It's really generic.
Distribution of the max that matters.
I'm sorry?
A bunch of Gaussian variables, it's the distribution of the
It doesn't have to be Gaussian, like it's much more general than that because it's a concentration. And so it's like Chernow bounds and Hefting bounds, which apply for many, many more distributions in Gaussian. Yeah, so you don't have to make a Gaussianity assumption at all. Yeah, okay, so the hope is that one can, the question is whether a neural strategy can achieve a factor n speed up, which is it possible to do this computation in log n time? Okay, and so now, so there's a problem with winner-take-all dynamics, it turns out, with the canonical circuit for the stochastic max problem. And what is the problem? The problem is, well, we saw in the deterministic case that the only hope you have of doing something efficient is to use strong inhibition. Weak inhibition was no good. So we're going to start there. So we'll start with strong inhibition. But it turns out that when you apply this winner-take-all dynamics with fluctuating inputs to a network, then the output of the network just remains flat. These neurons just fluctuate around some zero value, and nothing can take off. And as the network gets large, then you can not find any parameter settings. So this is like, as noise gets, as a function of noise, and n, the regime which has no winner-take-all dynamics gets big and starts to all the curves converge to almost basically no regime where there's actually a winner-take-all solution. And that's also true as you change parameters like self-excitation. There's just not a solution as you go out asymptotically in large n. Okay, and the reason for that is because really with strong inhibition, when noise is unbiased, right? It's sort of fluctuating in an unbiased way, but the problem is it's being shoved through the nonlinearity, which is the neuron, okay? And so it's rectified. And so now it means that neurons that are fluctuating are not contributing inhibition to the circuit. And so it's an example of unbiased fluctuation resulting in a biased effect, which is excess inhibition in the circuit. And so the question is, well, let's just go to weak inhibition. So you can apply, if you do weak inhibition and do the other obvious scaling, which is inhibition goes like 1 over n per neuron, then it turns out that there is an existence. There are winner-take-all states that exist out to very large n that we can find. They exist robustly. But the problem is that then it requires really exquisite fine-tuning, which is the self-excitation needs to be within 1 over n of a tuned value of 1, which as n goes to infinity, but even for large n, it's really crazy. Okay, and it's really slow. It scales linearly. The time complexity, these dashed lines, just like the serial. Well, not linearly. I'm sorry. It scales like basically faster, more strongly than linearly. Just like. Yeah.
So, in the strong inhibition, do you mean asymptotically for large n or for large n factorial?
I mean asymptotically for large n.
Exclamation point.
Oh, that's just an exclamation point. Large n.
Can I ask just
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So I'm trying to imagine what large n is, and so I was trying to draw.
It's not in italic.
I was trying to draw a line, so there's something about the sparsity of the maximum representation here, right? So what we're talking about here is a case where you have a single neuron that needs to win.
That's right.
Right? But if I think about real biological networks, we're never in that. We're always that there's some distributed pattern which has a certain level of sparsity that needs to win.
Yeah.
And that feels like we're more down in the 10 to the 2 to the 10 to the 3 at most.
Yeah.
So how concerned should I be, I guess is the question.
That's a great question. Actually, to be perfectly honest, we haven't studied like K winner-take-all time complexity, and it's something we want to do. So we just haven't done it yet. Yeah, but yeah. Yeah.
You emphasize inhibition, but the recurrent excitation actually helps.
So no, that's right. But no, that's right. No, so no, it doesn't help. It doesn't solve this problem, right? So you see that basically to guarantee a unique solution, we need alpha to be smaller than 1. So you would think you have perfect freedom with alpha. Here, there's no choice of alpha that's giving you what you want. So I can show you offline. But here, in the weak inhibition case, it turns out actually alpha is prescribed. You don't have freedom in choosing alpha. And then it has to be in exactly this interval, and this interval is shrinking to 0 very strongly within. So this is the issue, and so we can discuss. But yeah, in the weak inhibition case, there's no freedom in choosing alpha. Strong inhibition, you have freedom in choosing alpha, but it doesn't help. So that's the bottom line. So, but I wouldn't be giving this talk, this would be really pessimistic, and I would stop there and go down, and then you would not come to listen to me again. So there's actually something I want to present as an alternative model. So what I presented to you is the canonical model for winner-take-all dynamics. This is a modified model, okay, for stochastic max and argmax, and it's a winner-take-all circuit that actually has a second nonlinearity in the inhibition. Okay, and the assertion is that it can solve this large n problem. And so for example, here I'm showing you the case where the conventional canonical circuit failed, but this circuit wins. So the question, it succeeds as a winner. And the question is, what is the dynamics here? So the idea is that in this inhibition term, okay, a neuron xj can only contribute to this inhibitory effect in the circuit if its activation is above some threshold theta. Okay, so weakly active neurons, even if they're fluctuating around 0, cannot contribute inhibition to the circuit, and only these strong ones can. Okay, and so that's the idea. And just to say that this restores the regime, even at very large n, of the possibility of winner-take-all dynamics, and much more interestingly, yeah.
So, in the limit as n goes to infinity, all neurons are going to spend some time above theta, and so all order n neurons can contribute to inhibition. So why doesn't? Oh, because beta is 1 over n.
So, okay, so I'll confess that for the stochastic case, with this nonlinear inhibition, we have no analytical results. So I cannot tell you that asymptotically in the strict limit of n going to infinity, there will be a solution. But I can say that at least for very large n numerically, there is still a very robust solution. And in fact, we don't need to fine-tune theta. So that's all I can say. But I would love to talk about whether it's possible to say something analytical for the stochastic and nonlinear inhibition case. It just becomes difficult with the two nonlinearities. Yeah.
Is the
multi linear function important, or if you had something that's saturated in nonlinearity?
Yeah, so again, I don't know. I mean, now it becomes like this whole universe of nonlinearities to explore. I don't know. We can discuss again. That's something we can discuss. Yeah. So I want to just press through because I actually have a few minutes, and I want to talk about these results and then another set of results for small n. Okay, because those are relevant for the psychophysics of decision making. Okay, so the more interesting thing, okay, so the first basic thing is that this nonlinear inhibition actually restores the possibility to do winner-take-all dynamics with large n and noisy inputs. Okay, and secondly, this nonlinear inhibition circuit performs the operation with an accuracy and speed that matches the parallelism benchmark. Okay, so in other words, if you look at the decision time as a function of n, you'll see that the winner-take-all network has a scaling. This is a semi-log plot. These curves are log n in time, and they compare with this benchmark strategies, which are also log n over here. And in fact, the amount, this is actually absolute amount of time. You can see that they not only match in scaling, like they're both they're log n compared to the best case, the benchmark, but in fact, even numerically, there's only a discrepancy of like a factor of 2 or 3 in the absolute amount of time it takes as well. Okay, so I think that's pretty interesting. So this is speed at fixed accuracy. You can also ask the question of, if we just fix the speed, then what is the accuracy? And you can see that, you know, if we fix the speed, then the accuracy curve for the benchmark strategy is this purple curve, and in turn, the accuracy for the neural strategy is this dash curve. Okay, and just to say, okay, you should be shocked that this dash curve is actually above the purple curve, and that's because actually we've given the neural network a factor of 3 more time. So this dash curve is at a fixed speed, fixed amount of time, but a factor of 3 times more than this purple curve to try to match them out here asymptotically, and that's why the network strategies actually looks like it's doing better than the benchmark. It can't be, but it just has 3 times more time. That's all. Okay. So now what else is interesting? So the other thing I forgot to say is that weak inhibition networks, besides not even succeeding in the stochastic tasks, weak inhibition networks succeed in the stochastic task, but they require fine tuning, and they're slow, and in addition, they don't show speed accuracy trade-offs. Okay, but this network, this nonlinear inhibition network with strong inhibition, actually exhibits speed accuracy trade-offs. So this is a speed versus accuracy, and you can see that these curves exhibit a trade-off in speed and accuracy. And in fact, interestingly, the performance of these networks exhibits some kind of a form of stochastic resonance. So if we look at this plot, where this is the amplitude of noise, sigma eta, that's injected into each item on the list, you can see that if we just go across a slice here, okay, of so as we vary noise and keep a fixed n over here, just go across, then it turns out that the network actually has, and this is an accuracy plot, so then the accuracy is high, and then for some noise it gets a low, and then the accuracy gets high again. Okay, it's like this form of weird stochastic resonance where there's some intermediate noise at which it does poorly, but then a higher noise actually does better. So that, scratch your head, that's really weird. It turns out that actually these networks have this very nice and interesting self-adjusting behavior to their dynamics. So basically, when the noise that's being injected increases in amplitude, then the decision time increases. So this is time plot, and you can see that the decision time is increasing with the amount of injected noise. And so they're sort of flexibly adjusting how long they wait and average the input as a function of the amount of noise that's injected, and also actually as a function of n, which is the network size. So these networks have the self-adjusting dynamics where you don't need to tune parameters when you change the noise amplitude or change the size of the decision task. They self-adjust. Okay, so I want to just now finish by just telling you something about the small n case. So the small n case, where there's just a few, like handful of alternatives, up to 10, corresponds to an example or a model of multi-alternative forced-choice decision-making, which is studied very often by many people in the audience, including beautiful work by Xiaojing on decision-making in human psychophysics or in primate psychophysics experiments. So what's interesting is that, like in the large n case, if we look at decision time as a function of n in the small n regime, then we find that the decision time scales up as the log of n plus 1. At least this is the curve, is the dash is the simulations, and the black is this fit to this function over here. And in fact, the accuracy remains high at all of these values, and the reward rate, meaning the product of accuracy times inverse decision time, which is the reward rate, is something that is very close in this network with this dashed line compared to a benchmark strategy. Okay, so so this network, I mean, I just want to rush through it a bit faster than I have gone through the other slides, but basically the network is closely matching this parallelism benchmark, which is a non-leaky accumulation strategy for decision making. And in fact, it does it with completely fixed parameters. So now I'm not even talking about no parameter fine tuning. Here we can just fix the parameters, alpha and beta, in the network, and then vary n. And the network has near optimal performance for all choices of n because of these self-adjusting dynamics. Okay, and so what's interesting about that result for small n is a law called Hicks Law that's been observed, for, I guess, how old is Hicks Law? Something like like 100 years or so? Yeah, it's like 100 years old. It's some result from Mr. Hick. And from psychology experiments that go way back. And actually, Hicks Law has quite some notoriety, not in neuroscience, but actually in the fields of behavioral economics and product design and marketing, and also web design and all these things, because it turns out that there were some interesting experiments in marketing where customers are presented in a supermarket with a choice of 6 jams in a display, 6 flavors of jam. And when they're presented with this choice of 6 flavors of jam, then, first they're presented with a display of 24 options of jam. And when there are 24 options of jam, then 60% of the passerbys stop for a taste, but only 3% of them buy a jam. Okay, but when there are only 6 jams on display, then fewer people stop by, like 40%, but then about a third of them actually purchase a jam. Okay, so the idea is that increasing the number of options makes decision making much harder, and so that's why when you have product sales, you should give fewer numbers of options, right? And so again also for use of panels and things like that for pilots, there's some very important design considerations to be made based on Hicks Law. So Hicks Law is pretty notorious, and in fact the finding that Mr. Hick had is that Hicks. I guess this is not showing up, but the finding is that Hicks' finding was that the time it takes humans to make a decision for n options scales like log of n plus 1. Okay, so in other words, what I just want to say here is that Hicks Law is emerging from this nonlinear inhibition neural winner-take-all dynamics, and because those dynamics are an example of really full saturation of the parallelism sort of benchmark, Hicks Law is actually, I would argue, a symptom of fully parallel, efficient, fully parallel computation. Okay, and I'm going to skip this slide, but there are a lot of interesting results on the neural underpinnings, like what the neural responses look like when these decisions are being made in these circuits, and like some work by Zhao Jing and others, they actually explain some counterintuitive neural findings, which is that correct trials tend to converge faster than incorrect trials, which is a feature of attractor models, like the winner-take-all dynamic circuit is an attractor model. And also, interestingly, asymptotic level of the winning choice, the activity level of neurons in the winning choice, is actually higher under speed pressure. So meaning if you force a system to make a faster decision, the level to which the neural activity rises to its asymptotic value, that level is actually higher under speed pressure. And actually that goes against a lot of other phenomenological models, but it's seen in experiment, and this is what this model exhibits as well. So okay, so I'll just end by summarizing. So neural winner-take-all with strong nonlinear inhibition fully efficiently trades off space for time, achieving an speed up relative to the optimal serial strategies. Nonlinear inhibition prevents weakly active principal cells from contributing inhibition, and that allows, even in the presence of noise, for a winner to actually take off and win this competition. This circuit does not require any parameter fine-tuning, remarkably, for either fixed n or even as n varies, and it's because of this self-adjusting dynamics to noise and number of options. So it sort of automatically figures out what that is, reproduces Hicks Law, and then the question is, this computation that I described is in the context of a neural network, but it has very simple elements, right? There's just a global inhibition and a self-excitation. These are so generic and so simple that the question is, which of the principles that have arisen here, and then this observation of the importance of a nonlinear inhibition term could apply to distributed decision making in non-neural systems like these rock ants, who are making some very interesting nonlinear actually actions, which is like once they exchange information for some time and there's an integration process, but then at one point the foraging ants start to just physically pick up neurons in the colony and then move them to the the site of some food or to a new nest site, and at that point the competition process becomes extremely nonlinear, and then there's a very strong bias towards choosing that nest site. So I just thought that this picking up, or it's called tandem running behavior, might be some example of the second nonlinearity. So thank you very much. Oh, go ahead. Hi.
Would it make an interesting difference to put the noise outside of the nonlinearity, like in the activity of the neurons instead of the inputs?
Oh, yeah. So if you look at the neural network equation, actually it turns out that so the noise it doesn't much matter, right? Because you could not in the rates. If you put in the rates, it's a different thing. But if you put the noise in the xi's, right? If you put the noise in the xi's, it would look similar, right? But it's true that if you had the noise in the rates, it might be somewhat different. But ultimately, the thing is that it's going to go and get filtered, and then it's going to go through the filtering and a nonlinearity anyway. So you're going to get this problem. I'm sure that even in that case, the failure of strong inhibition canonical winner-take-all circuits to converge at large n is going to be still true, right? And in fact, there is a transformation too, right? There's like the Grossberg transformation where you can transform from having the nonlinearity. So if you forget about this nonlinear inhibition part, you can transform from having the nonlinearity out here to having a linear sum and then a linear sum of a set of nonlinear things. So I guess maybe we can try to work that out and figure out what it is. Yeah. So many questions. Yeah. Go ahead.
So maybe this is a related question. Do you have any intuition how the problem changes when you start using spiking neurons because of the nonlinearity that's basically directly, and the integration?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'm very interested in what happens with spiking neurons. And the reason is because, for many reasons, one of them is that, here, because we're using rates, this is like a high bandwidth communication, right? So the neurons are communicating with each other, but the bandwidth is high. And so the question is, what happens when you restrict the bandwidth of the pairwise communication between neurons? And and that's also related to these ant foraging decisions, because each ant comes in and makes a like they have their headbutts and little pheromonal exchanges, and presumably those are lower bandwidth communications. On the other hand, so you might think that the results could be quite different in spiking neurons, and I'm very interested to know. But on the other hand, because of the architecture of this network, all these excitatory neurons are sending their outputs to one inhibitory interneuron that's then inhibiting all of them. So even if the bandwidth if each of those channels is low, ultimately it's all a convergence to one pool and a sum. So the low bandwidth of each of those may not matter, because we're just pooling. We don't care about the detailed n-squared signals in the network. It's really just one sum. So maybe the limited bandwidth actually doesn't have an effect. So I've given you both sides, and I don't know what the answer is. Yeah.
So I would just point out that this nonlinearity in the drive through the inhibitory network is really exactly what's seen in pyramidal cell input to somatostatin interneurons, which are doing the recurrent inhibition, because that's facilitating synapse.
Facilitating synapse, yeah, great. Yes, exactly.
That's providing recurrence in cortical circuits.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. Yeah, exactly. I had this note to myself, like, discuss the mechanism, and I didn't, so that's right. So what? Okay, so great. And the other possibility is also, like, if you just have interneurons that are coincidence detectors, and so then they only respond to, coincidence spikes, which means like a high rate input rather than a lower rate input. So those are the two mechanisms that we could think of for that. But thank you for that. Yeah, great. Yeah.
It's a question about what your talk was really about. Stepping back a bit,
yeah.
It was about, as I understood it, the psychophysics of decision making.
No, the second part was okay, great. Yes, the second part was, the first part was more about like the max for inference, for example, even across all the neurons in a circuit. So large and small n. Yeah, that's it.
But very, very briefly then, where I got confused was you started bringing in what looked like phenomenology, things like Hicks Law.
Yes.
So at this point, you're going to have to change gear, because we have causal entities like attention start kicking in.
Yes.
Which decorrelate information fluctuation. This is Jude Mitchell and John Reynolds' work. So if you're going to up the gains to decisions which are within the sampling speed of consciousness, you're going to have to change what you're doing.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, that's certainly true. I mean, I think whenever, one starts thinking about things like, decision making or even short-term memory on timescales that are long enough, there are all of these strategies and mechanisms that are additional that could kick in. And so I can just say that the modest thing is that we're not accounting for all of that. We're just saying if you ignore all those processes, what scaling would you expect? This is the scaling you would expect, and you could ask, well, what should change if you include some of those processes? Yeah. Judging, can I take?
By the way, he published his paper in early 50s.
Okay, so not quite 100 years ago.
His early result assumes that you can maintain very high accuracy.
Correct, yeah, that's correct.
So here, I guess you can change the kind of task difficulty by changing the difference in the B values, right?
Yes, or the delta, the gap, or increasing the noise. You can do any of those things, yeah.
Do you still get this?
No, so it turns out that not, yeah. So yeah, that's a good question. I should go back and check when it breaks down. But it's true that once you start getting away from high accuracy, the scaling also doesn't hold anymore. So that's a good point. We should check that. Yeah. You're on?
So you mentioned that these noisy networks have this self-adjusting property in the time they wait until they make a decision.
Yeah.
Now, if you say put the noise in the inputs, then regardless of how you do the computation, there's a certain time that you need to wait in order to make a decision with a certain confidence.
Yes.
Right? And so I wonder whether, when you're saying that there's this self-adjusting, whether the scaling of the amount of noise is compatible with that.
Keeping the accuracy fixed. So again, we don't have analytics because this is the nonlinear network. We don't have analytics on that, but I can say that for fixed parameter settings, it seems like what it does. So the stochastic resonance effect I showed you is actually a sign that once the noise gets big enough, it's actually then sort of self-adjusting to average for too long, because once the noise gets big enough, the performance gets better, and the reason I can show you that the reason for the performance improving at high noise is actually like over averaging. So it's actually doing a little bit better. So it's kind of it's not exactly maintaining fixed accuracy, but I can show you curves where it maintains roughly fixed accuracy for a certain range of noise, and then it overcompensates.
I think you better hold the discussion there. Thank you, Ela.